Hello, I'm WP Suazo, and I'm here to talk to you today about crowding out. Crowding out is a phenomenon we hear talked about sometimes in business. When government proposes new spending, government will often cite how much new commerce, new spending will create, but critics are quick to point out that new spending might drive up prices. New government spending perhaps will drive up prices and crowd out private spending. So critics of government spending say that government spending never creates as much commerce as is promised because it in part backfires. Okay, so in the book by Bradley Schiller, he has a graph that accompanies this, and I'm going to draw it now. So vertically we have prices, and you could think of prices measuring pressure on the economy. So we have prices vertically. Horizontally we have GDP. Okay, so I'm going to put here prices, and down here I put GDP. All right, so let's say we have a depressed and timid aggregate demand. So I'll draw aggregate demand down here. Aggregate demand, AD. And we have a restrained aggregate supply up here in need of a positive supply shock, some deregulation, if you will. And current GDP is where aggregate supply and aggregate demand meet. So I'll put current GDP. And what we want to do is we want to get the economy to full GDP. And let's say full GDP is somewhere beyond current GDP. So let's say this here is full GDP. Now, I want to also show you current prices. So here are current prices. Current prices, let's say, are 100. I always start my current prices at 100. And we want to get GDP from this position to that position. What Schiller says in his book is that we have to, in essence, overshoot our target because of this crowding out. So here's what happens. We start at position A. So position A is comprised of current GDP and prices of 100. And what the government will do, the government will introduce new spending that pushes aggregate demand northeasterly. So here's the new aggregate demand. I'll call it aggregate demand prime. And it's pushed northeasterly by the stimulus. Okay. Temporarily, the economy will surge all the way out to here. Now, going from current out to this furthest position is called the fiscal shortfall. This is what government is trying to bridge, this fiscal shortfall. And then what happens is crowding out because of inflation. So we start at A, government action causes us to go to B, but because of the inflation, we get in part pushed back to C. And let's say inflation is 7% there. So we start at A, the government stimulus pushes us all the way out to B, and point B is comprised of this big GDP with the same prices, but the prices don't stay the same. What happens is all this pushing with the economy creates inflation that causes GDP to backslide. So some things I'll talk about here is this. If you want to know the sequence of events starts first with a government stimulus. More government spending, less taxes, some combination of the two. This causes the GDP to expand by the fiscal shortfall. So the fiscal shortfall is covered. Then what happens? Event 3 is that we have more inflation. And this more inflation will cause, in the end, this expansion only to be the size of the GDP gap. And let me show you the GDP gap. The GDP gap is the difference between current GDP and full GDP. The difference between current GDP and full GDP is the GDP gap. So there's a gap right there. And the portion of the fiscal shortfall that is lost to crowding. So there we have crowding right there. There we have crowding right there. Now to talk about this in terms of size, I didn't draw my graph to scale. The biggest item is the shortfall. The shortfall is the biggest impact on GDP, or the biggest measurement in GDP. That is followed by the GDP gap. The GDP gap is somewhere in the medium. So what I'll do is I'll describe these by ranking them. So in terms of size, well, the shortfall is the biggest. Call it biggest again, and I'll call it number 1. Second in size is the GDP gap, though it doesn't look that way by my graph. The third is the crowding caused by more inflation. So this more inflation could also be called crowding. And lastly, the smallest item is the stimulus. Often we'll hear politicians say, well, the new government spending sounds like a lot of money, but it's small in comparison to the changes it will do to GDP. They talk about the changes to GDP, but they don't talk about any potential changes to inflation. Critics of this model are quick to say that it's only applicable when operating around full GDP. It's only applicable when operating around full GDP. If the economy is deep in recession or depression, inflation is no concern whatsoever. During a recession or depression, inflation is not a threat. Okay, before we conclude here, I want to reverse this process and talk about crowding in. So let's say that we have an economy that is overheating. Let's say we have an economy that's too ambitious, too aggressive. So imagine an economy with big aggregate demand, people buying new cars, having new homes built, and aggregate supply very, very available. So here are prices, here's GDP. We have an economy that's too aggressive. So I always start prices with 100. Okay, so we have our current GDP right here. And in this case, I'll use numbers. So let's say $25 trillion right there. And let's say full GDP is at 23. So what has to happen? Our starting point here is A. The government would have to reduce the economy more than this difference of 2. And we have a positive gap here of 2. The government would have to reduce the economy more by this, more than this positive gap of positive 2. Why? Because we're going to see crowding in. So what happens? Well, the government will implement a fiscal drag to make AD go all the way to the left here. So current equilibrium goes from A temporarily to point B. So we have point B here, and let's say this is going to be 22. All right. What happens is the economy goes from A, transits through B, and then settles at C. And C is a point with smaller prices. So what is happening is the government sets off some policy, a fiscal drag, that causes the economy to contract all the way from A to B. So this big difference here is called the fiscal excess. This big difference here, so 25 minus 22 equals a free fiscal excess. So the economy starts at A, it transits through B, but because there's less pressure on the economy, the price level falls, and falling price level causes the economy to rebound to point C. So going from 22 back to 23, we have one of crowding in. We have one of crowding in. So I hope this clarifies crowding. I hope everyone's well out there, and thank you for watching.